Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to remember the July 21st, 1861 First Battle of Bull Run, the Civil War's first large-scale engagement, the South's first important victory, the skedaddle of Union troops from the fields and hills of Manassas to the safety of the U.S. Capitol. Casualties approached 5,000, and yet, as the bloody and brutal war dragged on into 1862, 1863, 1864, the Bull Run casualty list seemed almost tiny in comparison to Antietam with 22,800, Gettysburg with 51,000, and other deadly battlegrounds scattered across the eastern and western theaters of the war. But in 1861, the shocking scale of death from Bull Run seemed impossibly large and beyond the comprehension to many Americans. Newspapers carried poignant personal accounts of the carnage and death. Whether or not all these accounts are true or false is hard to know. Many were not named, individuals weren't named, so evidence to support them is difficult to find. Still, I want to share 4 such accounts that were published as part of a larger group in an Illinois newspaper, the Salem Advocate. So here's the first story. It's reportedly by a soldier who served in the 2nd Connecticut Infantry. So here we go. While at a halt, it was my lot to witness a very painful scene. I captured a prisoner, a German, belonging to the 8th South Carolina Regiment, and took him to Major Colburn for instructions as how to dispose of him. The prisoner requested one privilege as his last, which the major very humanely granted. He said, the German, that his brother lay a short distance off in a dying condition, and he wished to see him. I bade him lead the way, and I followed. He took me to an old log hut, but a few rods from where our regiment was halted. On the north side, in the shade, we found the wounded man. The prisoner spoke to him. He opened his eyes. The film of death had already overspread them, and the tide of life was fast ebbing. He was covered with blood, and the swarms of flies and mosquitoes, which were fattening upon the life's blood, indicated that he had lain there for some time. They joined hands together, muttered a few words in the German language, supplicated the throne of grace for their families at home, kissed, and bade each other a final adieu. The prisoner remarking, as I took him by the arm to lead him away, for the column was moving, "Brother, you are dying, and I am a prisoner." The man was shot with a musket ball in the back over the hip, from which fact I inferred that he was on the retreat when the deadly ball overtook him. The second story describes an encounter between a Union soldier and a Confederate from Georgia. Here we go. A rebel of the Georgia Regiment lay with a fearful shot wound in his side, which tore out several of his ribs. The lifeblood of the poor fellow was fast oozing out when one of our troops dashed forward from out of the melee and fell, sharply wounded, close beside him. The Georgian recognized his Union uniform, though he was fatally hurt, and feebly held out his hand. "We came into this battle," he said, "enemies. Let us die friends. Farewell." He spoke no more, but his companion in disaster took the extended hand and escaped to relate this touching fact. The third story involves a desperately wounded Union artilleryman. So here's the beginning of this story. An artilleryman lay on the ground, nearly exhausted from loss of blood and too weak to get out of the way of the tramping troops and horses that flitted about him. A mounted horseman came toward him when he raised the bleeding stumps of both his arms and cried out, "Don't tread on me, Captain. See, both of my hands are gone." The trooper leapt over him. A shell broke nearby, and the crashing fragments put the sufferer quickly out of his misery. Here's the fourth and final story. It is particularly connected to my interest in collecting Civil War photography because it involves a mortally wounded Union soldier and a photograph. So here we go. One of the Zouaves was struck by a cannon shot which tore through his thigh close to his body, nearly severing the limb from the trunk. As he fell, he drew his photograph from his breast and said to his nearest comrade, "Take this to my wife. Tell her that I died like a soldier, faithful to my country's cause and the good old flag. Goodbye." And he died where he fell. So there you have 4 stories of death and carnage, destruction on the battlefield of Bull Run, July 21st, 1861. Stories reported in Northern newspaper and throughout many newspapers. There are dozens and dozens of these accounts, folks trying to come to terms with the scale of death and destruction by relaying these individual stories of death on the battlefield. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.